The fluorescent lights of St. Michael's emergency department hum their endless mechanical prayer at 4:16 a.m., a sound like electricity learning to breathe. Brooke Sullivan moves through the pre-dawn shift with the kind of efficiency that looks like meditation to anyone watching, but it's something else entirely: muscle memory that doesn't forget, hands that have done this work in places where the lights didn't hum, where the silence between heartbeats could kill you if you weren't counting. She restocks the suture kits in supply room C, her movements economical and exact. The instruments slip into their designated slots like soldiers filing into formation, the needle holders first, then the forceps, then the scissors, all of them in the couple cross-stitch configuration, the field medic arrangement that lets you grab what you need in darkness or chaos or blood. She doesn't think about why she arranges them this way. Her hands just know. Her hands have always known. The scar bisecting her left eyebrow catches the fluorescent light as she reaches for the top shelf. It's thin, professional, the kind you get when there's no anesthetic and you don't flinch anyway. Her knuckles are a topography of older damage, the pale line across her left index finger from a broken suture needle in Helmand Province, a divot in her right wrist from shrapnel that the surgeons decided to leave rather than risk nerve damage, fingerprints that sometimes catch her own attention and remind her of things she's supposed to forget. The scrub jacket she wears is navy blue, heavier than it needs to be for a Raleigh summer because something is sewn into the lining. Something that shifts when she reaches overhead. Something that hasn't seen daylight in 18 months. She doesn't touch it. Not here. Not where the security cameras can see. Dr. Marcus Pierce arrives at 6:06 a.m., his Italian loafers clicking against linoleum like a countdown timer. His shoes alone cost more than Brooke's monthly rent, and he walks with the particular assurance of someone who's never had to doubt that the world will bend to his will. His clipboard is thick with incident reports, post-it notes flagged in aggressive yellow, and his smile when he sees her in the medication bay is the smile of a man assembling a case. He doesn't greet her. He simply appears behind her left shoulder, close enough that she could feel his breath if she turned. She doesn't turn. Sullivan. Still here? Night shift ended at 6. His voice carries the particular texture of condescension reserved for those he's already decided are disposable. The click of his pen. The scratch of his pen against his clipboard. These sounds matter. These sounds build files. Brooke's chart entry doesn't waver. Her handwriting remains steady as a laser. Finishing documentation, Dr. Pierce. 4 words. Nothing more. Nothing that can be weaponized. She's had 18 months to perfect the art of saying the absolute minimum. His shadow stretches across her paperwork like a threat. We'll see about that. Documentation quality has been a concern with you, hasn't it? He doesn't wait for an answer. He already has the answer. He's already building the narrative. He walks away smiling, and Brooke's jaw clamps tight, not visibly, not obviously, just a slight tension in the muscle that used to mean she was about to clear a room with a 9mm, but now means she's going to chart another 12 hours without showing anyone what she's actually capable of. The ER fills as sunrise approaches. Resident physicians shuffle in looking like the undead, interns trailing behind them with the anxious energy of people still trying to prove they belong here. The nurses work in that pre-dawn state where the night shift is too tired to pretend to be friendly and the day shift hasn't yet arrived to disrupt the careful choreography everyone has built. Brooke moves between trauma bays with the fluidity of someone trained by muscle memory that predates this hospital by a decade. She checks the crash carts again, verifies drug expiration dates with the thoroughness of someone who's watched people die because someone else was careless. Epinephrine. Atropine. Amiodarone. Each drug carefully inventoried, each dose precisely calculated. The ventilator in Bay 3 weasels its mechanical rhythm, and she adjusts the oxygen concentration without being asked. The resident supervising should be checking this. Instead, he's scrolling through his phone. She doesn't point this out. She never points anything out. Just fixes it quietly. Saves the patient. Takes the blame when something goes wrong. At 7:14 a.m., the ambulance sirens cut through the building like a scream that knows exactly what it's coming to say. Two of them, stacked together, the kind of staggered arrival that means multiple casualties. The radio crackles in dispatch, incoming trauma. Vehicle versus vehicle on Interstate 40. Approximate ETA for minutes. We're bringing two patients, both stable vitals at scene, one with penetrating abdominal wound, one with suspected thoracic trauma from. The transmission breaks into static. Brooke already has the trauma bays opening, the lights brightening, the equipment repositioning itself into combat readiness. This is the part she's good at. This is the part where her hands move faster than her thoughts, where 18 months of suppressed capability suddenly becomes useful. She feels it like electricity in her sternum, that old alertness, that old hunger. Her voice drops an octave without her conscious permission. Bay 1 and Bay 2. Get me the ultrasound for fast protocol. A resident jumps. She didn't realize she was giving orders. She wasn't. Not really. It just happened. The ambulance bay doors slam open and the first stretcher comes through like a controlled explosion. The paramedic is calling vitals, blood pressure holding at 98/62, heart rate 94, breathing at 16. The patient is a man in his late 50s, chest caked with dried blood, but the bleeding seems controlled. What catches Brooke's attention is that he's military. She sees it in the way he's gripping the stretcher rail with his right hand, in the corded muscle of his forearm, in the tactical awareness of his eyes tracking the room even through pain. She sees it because she's trained to see it. The second stretcher follows behind, and it's this patient who makes the entire trauma bay freeze for a half second. This patient is Captain Christopher Hayes, Navy, and he has shrapnel wounds from a Kandahar IED, and his eyes lock directly on Brooke's face the moment the stretcher wheel catches the ER floor. The paramedics rattle off vitals, 45-year-old male, multiple penetrating lacerations to left upper extremity and anterior chest, largest fragment approximately 3 centimeters, still embedded, we've controlled hemorrhage with direct pressure and tourniquet to the upper arm, vital stable at present, patient alert and oriented, GCS 1502 sat 96 on high flow. They're good. The paramedics are very good. But Captain Hayes isn't looking at them. He's looking at her. Dr. Pierce materializes in the trauma bay with the speed of a man who's been hovering near the ambulance dock, waiting for a crisis that he can control. I'll take both cases, he announces, voice already pulling rank, already centering himself as the decision-maker. Sullivan, assist me on the Navy captain. Rodriguez, you're with Dr. Caldwell on the abdominal trauma. A junior resident named Rodriguez looks relieved. Brooke nods, says nothing, begins opening the suture kits and trauma instruments with movements so precise they look choreographed. She's done this exact procedure in darkness. She's done it with hands shaking from adrenaline and blood in her eyes. She's done it on soldiers whose names she wasn't allowed to remember. This is different. This is just a suture. Just a procedure. Just 18 months of pretending to be someone other than who she is. Captain Hayes is watching her the entire time. His eyes track her hands as she arranges the instruments, as she begins irrigating the deepest laceration on his left upper shoulder, the one that's still slowly bleeding despite the pressure bandages. The fragment itself is visible, dark and cruel, embedded in the flesh about 2 centimeters below the clavicle. She begins suturing the edges of the wound with the specific cross-stitch pattern that field medics in Kandahar learned from combat surgeons who learned it from military hospitals in places that don't exist on any official map. Over and under. Cross and stitch. 3 passes. 4. The pattern is distinctive. The pattern is unmistakable. The pattern is absolutely forbidden anywhere except in classified briefing rooms and classified combat zones and classified vehicles that disappeared into classified nights in classified cities. That's a Kabul cross-stitch. Captain Hayes's voice is hoarse, stripped raw by pain or by recognition or by both. His eyes have gone somewhere distant. His hand grips the armrest of the stretcher with enough force to crack the plastic. You know that pattern. It's not a question. It's a statement of fact delivered by someone who's looked down at his own wounds in field hospitals on the other side of the world and seen exactly this sequence of stitches, performed by someone whose face he wasn't supposed to remember and whose name he wasn't supposed to know. Brooke's hand doesn't pause. Her breath doesn't hitch. Her jaw doesn't clench in any visible way. She finishes the fourth pass, ties the knot with a precision that would make a surgeon weep, cuts the suture thread. Her voice emerges calm and professional and completely neutral. Couple cross-stitch is standard protocol for deep lacerations. Minimizes scarring. She's lying. Both of them know she's lying. He knows she's lying. But she doesn't flinch. She doesn't break. She simply moves to the next laceration, the next wound, the next piece of evidence that she exists in a context that this hospital and this city and this entire life aren't supposed to know about. Dr. Pierce is watching the interaction. His eyes narrow. He files it away. Another inconsistency. Another thing that doesn't fit the narrative of just a nurse. Brooke keeps working. Her hands move like they've moved 1,000 times before, in places that don't appear on the medical school curriculum. Captain Hayes keeps watching her like she's someone he thought he'd lost, someone whose call sign he wasn't supposed to speak aloud, someone whose very presence in this hospital is impossible and real and absolutely undeniable. The monitors beep their steady rhythm. The fluorescent lights hum. The pre-dawn shift ends and the day shift begins, and nothing has changed except everything. The sutures are placed. The bleeding stops. The wound is clean and closed and the patient is stable, and somewhere in the next few hours, very specific people are going to receive very specific phone calls, and the careful architecture of Brooke's 18-month disappearance is about to begin its collapse. But right now, in this moment, she finishes tying the final suture, steps back, and her voice is so steady it sounds like a threat. "You're all set, Captain. Dr. Pierce will want imaging before we move you to observation." The conference room held exactly 12 attending physicians for Thursday grand rounds, seated in ascending tiers like a Roman amphitheater. Dr. Pierce stood at the podium, projector humming behind him, when he clicked to the first slide. Brooke Sullivan's charting filled the screen in magnified text, each line a confession waiting to happen. "This," Pierce announced, laser pointer circling her notes in sharp red loops, "represents the kind of substandard documentation that puts St. Michael's at legal risk." His voice carried the precision of a prosecutor building a case. The doctors shifted in their seats, Dr. Reeves in cardiology, Dr. Chen in emergency medicine, Dr. Patel, Dr. Morrison, Dr. Caldwell, Dr. Jong, Dr. O'Brien, Dr. Kuzuma, Dr. Bennett, Dr. Crawford, Dr. Ahmed, and Dr. Sterling. 12 men who controlled schedules, grant approvals, fellowship placements. 12 men who knew exactly what happened when you contradicted Pierce. Patient responsive to verbal stimuli, Pierce read aloud, his tone dripping condescension. "Which verbal stimuli, Nurse Sullivan? What specifically did you say? What was the exact response?" He didn't wait for answers. He didn't expect them. The charting was merely a vehicle for something larger, a public dismantling, methodical and surgical. Alert and oriented times 3. But oriented to what, precisely? Did you assess temporal orientation? Seasonal orientation? Geographic specificity? Brooke stood in the back corner of the conference room, required to attend the critique of her own work. Required to stand silent while 12 physicians watched her documented failures materialize on a screen. Her jaw clenched once, a muscle jumping near her ear, but her hands remained relaxed at her sides. Her breathing unchanged. She maintained eye contact with the projection screen, not the audience, her face showing the emotional range of carved granite. Her composure was a weapon they didn't recognize as one. Pierce continued for 7 excruciating minutes, dissecting every alleged deficiency, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, powerful, patient, capable of demolition. "The nursing assessment here is dangerously vague. We practice evidence-based medicine at St. Michael's, not intuition." He turned slightly, just enough to let the audience see his expression of professional disappointment. The doctors watched. They knew. Dr. Reeves started to speak, his mouth opened, jaw working, then closed it. His fingers drummed once on the desk. Pierce's research funding had tripled last year. Reeves had stalled for 18 months. After the presentation, Pierce staged his exit past Brooke, angling his body so she had to step aside. He spoke loud enough for the dispersing physicians to hear. Perhaps military nursing standards differ from civilian excellence. The words landed like shrapnel, designed to fragment and spread. A few doctors glanced at her. Most looked away. The third physician, the one who might have defended her, was already gathering his papers. Later that afternoon, at the third-floor vending machines during shift change, 2 residents waited for their energy drinks. Dr. Chen, the same Chen from Grand Rounds, nudged Dr. Patel. They stood 5 feet from the wall of machines, voices low but not careful. "Did you hear Pierce destroyed that washed-up nurse playing soldier at Rounds?" Chen's laugh was sharp and performative. Apparently she thinks battlefield medicine translates to actual hospital work. Like she learned something useful before she ended up here pushing meds. Patel snorted. The machine dispensed a Red Bull with a metallic clank. Brooke stood 3 feet away at the water fountain, refilling her bottle with measured precision. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a sound like insects trapped in plastic. Her hand didn't shake as she twisted the cap. She didn't turn her head. She didn't acknowledge them. Her presence was so still they forgot she was breathing. She walked past them to the stairwell, her footsteps neither faster nor slower than usual, her pace calibrated to show no reaction, no emotion, no wound. The door closed with a pneumatic hiss behind her. That afternoon, Pierce appeared at the nurses' station with Security Chief Anderson at 1430 hours, exactly when Brooke was on break, calculated timing, designed for maximum audience. "Nurse Sullivan, there's a discrepancy in the narcotics log from your shift," Pierce announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying across the station. "Mr. Anderson needs to review your locker." 20 nurses heard it. 20 nurses saw the security escort. It was theater. Pierce had already reviewed the log. Already knew it was clean. But the public spectacle of suspicion was the point. The implication of theft, floating in the air like smoke. When Brooke returned from break, Anderson was waiting. "Just routine," he said quietly, apologetically. His own voice said he knew this was a setup. But the paperwork would be filed. The incident would be documented. She retrieved her locker key without comment, followed Anderson down the hall, her presence drawing every eye in the department. The locker contained 3 items, a change of clothes, a protein bar, and a combination lock. Anderson documented this, verified the narcotics count was correct, apologized quietly. "This is bullshit," he muttered, but his words didn't matter. 20 people had seen her escorted by security. 20 people had drawn their own conclusions. Pierce's documentation trail grew thicker, each entry a brick in the structure he was building. Substandard charting. Poor judgment. Now, possible substance abuse concerns. Each incident alone was survivable. Together, they formed a pattern. A narrative. A termination case. But that wasn't the worst part. That afternoon, Brooke accessed her secure email on a hospital computer she used only for clinical coordination. An encrypted message from a number she hadn't called in 18 months, "Captain. We have a situation. Stand by." The sender field showed only a military routing cipher. Her hands moved to close the browser immediately, protocol, muscle memory, but not before she understood. Something in her past was moving. Something in her present was about to collide with it. At 1847 hours, the ambulance bay doors rolled open and a stretcher wheeled through. Paramedic calling report to the ER nurse coordinator, Captain Christopher Hayes, male, 42, stable vitals but deteriorating, embedded shrapnel wounds right shoulder and chest, military transport accident, morphine on board, ETA for handoff now. Brooke took the report before Pierce could assign the patient. Her hands moved through the assessment with mechanical precision, cutting away the field dressing, beginning the irrigation, examining the wound pattern. The shrapnel fragmentation bloomed outward in a signature configuration that only existed in one place on Earth. Kandahar. An IED. Pressure plate device detonated under a convoy. The wound pattern was the kind she'd seen in bizarre aftermath sites, in forward operating base trauma courses, in her hands during 3 tours in 2009, 2011, and 2013. Captain Hayes' eyes were morphine-glazed, but they tracked to her hands, watching her finger placement, her swab technique, the specific interlocking pattern of her sutures. "Mid-closure," he whispered hoarsely, "that's a couple cross-stitch." The specific interlocking pattern used for field-wound closure when you're working in the dark without proper lighting. The kind taught only in forward operating base trauma courses. Impossible to learn from textbooks. Impossible to learn anywhere except where she'd learned it. Brooke's hands continued moving, but something behind her eyes shifted, a recalibration, a reassessment of threat level, a door opening in the past she'd sealed shut. "You're seeing things, Captain. Morphine does that." But her next suture followed the exact same pattern. His hand moved fractionally on the gurney, fingers forming a tactical sign for friendly, the hand language of special operations teams, the communication of people who operated in darkness and silence. Throughout the evening shift, 12 different attending physicians rotated through Hayes Bay. Pierce at 1915. Reeves at 2020. Chen and Patel together at 2045. Morrison, Caldwell, Jong, O'Brien, Kuzuma, Bennett, Crawford, and Ahmed, each reviewing his chart, each noting his stable vitals, each documenting their clinical assessment. By 2100, the collective medical opinion was crystallized in the chart: patient stable, pain managed, morning CT scan scheduled, surgical consult can wait until day shift. Nothing urgent. Nothing that required night shift intervention. All 12 attendings left by 21:15. Their cars pulled out of the physician parking lot. Their Pegas transferred to the answering service. The night shift skeleton crew took over, 2 first-year residents who'd been awake for 17 hours already. Brooke watched it all from the periphery of her assigned duties, moving through the ER with the quiet efficiency of someone trained to observe without being observed. She restocked supply closets. She checked monitors. She walked past Hayes' room every 12 minutes, watching his respiratory rate climb incrementally, watching the pallor creep into his nail beds, watching his oxygen saturation drift downward 1 percentage point at a time. 88, 87, 86, the numbers spelling a story the residents hadn't learned to read yet. At 01 for 7 hours, she was restocking the supply closet when she heard it, the change in his breathing pattern, the wet sound of air going where it shouldn't go. Tension pneumothorax. The kind that kills you quietly if you're not listening. The kind that only exists when no one's watching. At 0152 hours, the monitor numbers started their descent. Captain Hayes' oxygen saturation dropped from 94 to 87 in 90 seconds, the kind of fall that doesn't forgive hesitation. His chest rose on only the left side now, the right staying flat and silent. Brooke saw it first, the trachea visibly shifting right, his lips darkening from pink to something closer to slate. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, collapsing the lung, crushing the heart with the pressure of a fist that never opened. The 2 residents froze exactly as they were trained not to. Dr. Simmons stared at the monitor. Dr. Park's hand hovered near the phone, trembling. Neither of them moved. Captain Hayes' eyes found Brooke across the room, wide and conscious and carrying the weight of a man who'd survived IED blasts in Kandahar and knew exactly what suffocation felt like when it came with equipment failing instead of shrapnel tearing. His hand clawed at his chest. Once. Twice. A silent plea that needed no translation. Brooke didn't announce her decision. She didn't call for backup or wait for protocol clearance. Her hands moved before her brain caught up, muscle memory from transport helicopters and blown-out compound walls where hesitation meant adding another name to the casualty list. She moved to the crash cart, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who'd done this under fire, in darkness, with her patient bleeding out and time running backwards. 14-gauge needle. Angiocath. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Her left hand counted the ribs, 1, 2, while her right hand prepared the needle with a pressure and angle that comes from experience that official records couldn't acknowledge. The needle drove through skin and muscle and pleural membrane in one fluid motion, not tentative, not careful, just certain. The hiss of released air filled the room like the sound of a tire deflating, but underneath it was something else, the sound of pressure releasing, of a body getting a second chance. Hayes' lips began pinking up within seconds. His oxygen saturation climbed on the monitor like a redemption arc, 82%, 86%, 91%, 94%. His fingers uncurled from his chest. His breathing eased into something that resembled life instead of drowning. Brooke's face showed nothing but clinical focus as she withdrew the needle, applied the occlusive dressing, secured it with tape. Her hands were steady as surgical lasers. Her voice never shook when she spoke to the residents, "Get me a chest tube kit and call radiology for portable X-ray confirmation." It wasn't a request. It was a command. The residents moved. Finally. Park called upstairs. Simmons gathered supplies like someone waking from a dream. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was already walking through the door. Dr. Pierce stood in the threshold in street clothes, his tie loosened from wherever he'd gone to avoid being here, his clipboard already in his hand, the kind of man who carried contingency plans the way other people carried car keys. The automated critical event notification had pulled him back, the hospital's system flagging crash cart activation because protocols existed and money followed protocol and Pierce always followed money. He photographed the procedure tray with his phone before anyone could move the instruments. The click of the camera shutter was louder than it should have been. Brooke's jaw tightened 1 millimeter, the only visible response to a man building her destruction in real time. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Pierce's voice carried the tone of someone asking a rhetorical question they'd already decided the answer to. He moved to the bedside, his eyes scanning Captain Hayes like the patient was a fact pattern in a legal brief instead of a man who'd been turning blue 60 seconds ago. Hospital Protocol Section 47B explicitly prohibits nurses from performing invasive procedures without direct physician supervision. Brooke didn't respond. She didn't explain. She didn't defend. She simply continued her work, checking the dressing seal, verifying oxygen flow, documenting vital signs with the precision of someone who'd learned that evidence preservation mattered more than vindication. Pierce turned to the residents. "Dr. Simmons, Dr. Park, you witnessed this violation." They nodded. Miserably. They were good residents, smart enough to know that contradicting an attending physician meant their schedules would become nightmares, their evaluations would suffer, their fellowship applications would carry invisible asterisks that doors could read. They'd watched 12 other attending physicians in this hospital learn that same lesson during the months Pierce had been building his infrastructure. 12 doctors who'd gone home rather than speak up when Brooke's competence threatened his narrative. Pierce was already typing on his phone, copying the hospital administrator, the nursing director, risk management. His thumbs moved with the satisfaction of someone playing chess and just removing his opponent's queen. "Nurse Sullivan, you're suspended pending investigation. Leave the floor immediately." Captain Hayes tried to speak but his voice was too weak, still raw from the trauma tunnel his body had just escaped. He reached for Brooke's wrist, his fingers barely making contact, a gesture that said everything his lungs couldn't manage yet. Brooke removed her gloves. The rubber snapped softly as she peeled them off, that sound like a period at the end of a sentence. She dropped them in the biohazard bin with the kind of deliberate care that made the gesture look like ritual instead of resignation. Her eyes didn't meet Pierce's. She didn't need to. She was already walking toward the exit, her spine straight, her hands loose at her sides, the portrait of someone who'd survived worse than suspensions and accusations and career destruction. The faded unit patch sewn into her jacket lining, the one that represented 18 months of scrubbing herself clean, suddenly felt like it weighed nothing and everything simultaneously. Pierce called after her, his voice following her down the corridor like a closing argument, "This is grounds for termination and board review. You just ended your career to play hero." She didn't turn around. The hallway lights hummed their fluorescent song above her, indifferent to the fact that she'd just made the only choice that mattered. Behind her, Captain Hayes' monitor showed a steady sinus rhythm. His oxygen saturation held at 96. His heart rate was dropping back into the range of the living. That was the moment everything changed. Not because Brooke was fired, she'd already accepted that possibility when she'd made the decision to save a man's life instead of protect her own future. Everything changed because a man in street clothes had just committed what would turn out to be the first act of a betrayal so profound that it would eventually bring more than just Dr. Pierce to his knees. But Brooke didn't know that yet. All she knew was the weight of the stairwell door closing behind her, the sound of her shoes on the concrete steps, and the absolute certainty that she'd made the right choice even though it had just cost her everything. At 3:17 in the morning, the Waffle House on Capitol Boulevard was a fluorescent purgatory. Brooke Sullivan sat in the corner booth, the vinyl seat cracking beneath her with each small shift of weight. The chrome napkin holder reflected her face in warped fragments, nose elongated, eyes hollowed out, mouth a thin line that belonged to someone else entirely. She'd been staring at the same cold coffee for 40 minutes, watching an oily skin form across the surface like something dying slowly in still water. The server had stopped asking if she wanted anything else. 18 months ago, a DIA handler named Morrison sat across from her in a safe house in Arlington, fluorescent lights humming overhead just like these, and told her the extraction never happened. The Kandahar safe house, the asset, the 3-day operation that had cost her the use of her left shoulder and nearly cost her everything else, officially erased. "You don't exist," Morrison had said, his voice flat as a surveillance transcript. "Your face is too recognizable. Anyone who operated in Regional Command South might identify you. If that happens, if anyone connects you to those operations, we disavow immediately. You understand? Criminal charges. Stolen valor. Impersonation. We will not acknowledge you." She'd understood perfectly. They'd scrubbed her personnel file, buried her Navy Cross in classified archives, issued her a social security number with no military history attached. No deployments. No Purple Hearts. No rank. Just a nursing license and a name and a face that had learned to be invisible in plain sight. The 5th Fleet patch she'd worn under her uniform for 4 years, the one her captain patient had sewn into her jacket lining during a 300 hours debriefing in Helmand Province, now lived in a storage unit off Western Boulevard, wrapped in acid-free tissue, waiting for a future that might never arrive. Brooke lifted the coffee cup. Didn't drink. The warmth was the only thing she could feel. Her phone buzzed at 0314. Official termination notice from St. Michael's HR effective immediately. Final paycheck by certified mail. State board notification already filed. Hospital credentials permanently revoked pending investigation. 3 paragraphs of bureaucratic language that translated to, Pierce had moved fast, and he'd moved with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed this destruction in his mind 100 times. She could see it clearly now, the way he positioned himself during grand rounds, the way he'd waited for exactly 12 attending physicians to assemble, the way he'd held up her charting like evidence at a tribunal. 12 doctors. Every single one had the power to defend her. None had spoken. She wondered if they were sleeping well. By 0820, her phone had buzzed twice more with messages from colleagues asking if she was okay. By 0856, those messages had stopped coming. The hospital's official position was already posted: St. Michael's does not tolerate substandard documentation practices or protocol violations. We are committed to patient safety and regulatory compliance. Translation: Pierce had already won the narrative battle before she'd even left the building. Brooke returned to St. Michael's at shift change, moving through the hallways like someone who still belonged there. Her badge still worked, security hadn't disabled it yet, and her muscle memory was a weapon that could carry her anywhere. She needed to see Hayes one more time. Just to confirm his oxygen saturation was stable, just to know that the needle decompression had held, just to know that one person had lived because she'd refused to freeze. The ICU was quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists at the hinge point between night and morning. She was passing room for 12 when the man inside raised his head. New patient, guarded by 2 federal agents in suits that screamed alphabet agency. No name on the chart. No surgical history. Just, protected witness 7734. The man's eyes locked onto hers with the force of a physical collision, and his face shifted from unconscious to absolutely conscious in a single breath. He was older than she remembered. Grey at the temples. A surgical scar on his left cheek she didn't recognize. But the eyes, those hadn't changed. She knew those eyes. He whispered in Pashto, a language she'd sworn never to speak again in a place where someone could hear, Kafir. Ghost. The word stopped her pulse. Rashid. Taliban logistics officer. The man who'd provided the coordinates for the safe house extraction 18 months ago. The man whose betrayal of his own commanders had made the entire operation possible. The man she'd pulled to safety while rounds snapped overhead and her shoulder joint separated from the socket and a private named Chen screamed because his femoral artery had been severed by shrapnel. She'd saved Rashid's life in Kandahar. Now he was here, under federal protection, and he'd recognized her in the 0.3 seconds it took her to pass his doorway. A voice behind her, steady and professional, Captain Sullivan. She turned. Marine Colonel, dress blues, bearing the particular composure of someone who'd read her file. His name tag read Vance. His eyes carried the weight of classified knowledge. "I think we need to talk," he said. Not a request. A command. 30 seconds later, Colonel Vance was holding a tablet, accessing biometric databases that required Pentagon-level clearance, and pulling up her sealed military file. The corridor was empty except for the federal guards and the distant sound of monitors from the ICU bays. His voice, when he read, was loud enough to carry, Sullivan, Brooke E., Captain, United States Navy. Navy Cross for Valor under fire. Dr. Pierce emerged from the nurse's station like something rising from murky water. His face was already flushed, his voice already rising. "This is fraud. Impersonation. She's claiming military service she never." Colonel Vance continued without breaking rhythm. Bronze Star with V device for combat Valor, 3 Purple Hearts, 18 classified operations across Regional Command South, assigned to SEAL Team Support, designated call sign. Security. Pierce was shouting now, his phone already in hand. Hospital Administrator. Medical Board. This nurse is engaged in criminal fraud. The hallway was filling with people. Charge nurses. Residents. A surgical attending named Reeves who'd sat silently through Pierce's grand rounds presentation, watching him dissect Brooke's charting with the precision of someone performing an autopsy. Now Reeves stood frozen, watching Colonel Vance read her commendations like an indictment of Pierce himself. A 2-star general stepped out of the elevator. His uniform was sharp enough to draw blood. His bearing was the kind of physical presence that made the air pressure change, that made every person in the corridor unconsciously straighten their spine. 2 Pentagon liaisons flanked him, a commander named Torres and a captain named Morrison, the same Morrison who'd buried Brooke's identity 18 months ago. The general walked directly to her and rendered a crisp, perfect salute. She was wearing civilian clothes. Her discharge was supposed to be disavowed. Technically, she wasn't entitled to military protocol. The general held the salute anyway for 5 full seconds, his arm steady, his eyes locked on hers with the weight of institutional acknowledgement. "Captain Sullivan," he said, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone who'd commanded theater-level operations. "The Pentagon sends its regards." The hallway had gone completely silent except for the ventilator hiss from nearby patient rooms and the electronic beeping of cardiac monitors. Brooke counted 23 staff members with phones raised, recording. Pierce was frozen mid-dial, his face transitioning from crimson to ash. Commander Torres stepped forward with a tablet, his voice crisp and official, service record. "Sullivan, Brooke Elizabeth. Captain, United States Navy. Commission 2012. Dr. Reeves dropped his coffee cup. The splash was loud on the linoleum. Special Operations Medical Support, Torres continued. Deployed, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Somalia. A nurse named Patterson gasped. Dr. Chen, the same resident who'd mocked her at the vending machine about being a washed-up soldier, looked like he'd been physically struck. Unit assignment, SEAL Team Support, Task Force 714, Regional Command South. One of the federal guards standing outside the witness room snapped to attention, recognizing the unit designation. Decorations, Navy Cross for actions on November 3, 2018, Kandahar Province. Led 11-person extraction team into Taliban-controlled territory under direct fire. Personally treated for critically wounded personnel while coordinating air support. Resulted in successful exfiltration of high-value intelligence asset. 0 friendly casualties. The surgical resident Brooks whispered "holy shit" loudly enough that no one could pretend they hadn't heard it. Torres paused, letting that sentence settle like sediment. Then, Bronze Star with V device for Valor at Mosul. Purple Hearts for wounds received in Helmand, Kandahar, and Al-Hasaka. Combat Action Ribbon. Presidential Unit Citation. Pierce's clipboard hit the floor. Captain Morrison, the DIA handler who'd orchestrated her erasure 18 months ago, stepped forward with a recording device. His voice carried the particular chill of someone reading someone their last rites. "DRO Pierce, we've been investigating St. Michael's billing irregularities for 6 weeks. Captain Sullivan's placement here was operationally advantageous." He pressed play. Pierce's voice, confident, laughing, utterly careless, discussing inflated procedure codes with a pharmaceutical representative, detailing kickback percentages, describing the procedures that billed on patients who'd never received treatment. 47 seconds of self-incrimination, crystal clear, amplified through the corridor. The Navy buried Captain Sullivan's identity following a disavowed operation, Morrison continued. Her cover as a civilian nurse was maintained for operational security. You attempted to terminate a decorated combat veteran to protect a fraud scheme worth approximately $847,000. General Richardson turned to Brooke. His salute had dropped, but his bearing remained absolute. Your call sign was Kafir. Ghost. You moved through hostile territory invisible, saving lives no one could acknowledge. You became a nurse because that's what you've always been. Just without the uniform. Brooke's voice, when she spoke, was quiet enough that people had to lean in to hear. I just wanted to work, sir. Pierce was backing toward the stairwell now, his phone already raised, calling his attorney. Security Chief Anderson was moving to intercept. Dr. Reeves was staring at his hands. The nurse Patterson was crying without sound, her shoulders shaking, her phone still recording. The video would have 847,000 views by noon. By evening, it would be 3 million. By the next morning, it would be trending nationally. #Ghost Operative. #Navy Cross Nurse. #DR Pierce Arrest. But that was Act 6. Act 7. The epilogue. Right now, in the 0857 hours of this morning, Brooke Sullivan stood in a hospital corridor in Raleigh, North Carolina, surrounded by people who'd spent 18 months dismissing her as just a nurse, and watched her entire erased identity reassemble itself before their eyes like a photograph developing in reverse. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She just stood there, completely composed, and let the truth do what truth does best, burn everything that couldn't withstand it. The room had been quiet for exactly 3 seconds when the patient under armed guard opened his eyes. Brooke was checking his full line, standard post-operative protocol, vital stable, oxygen saturation climbing back to normal, when his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. Not aggressive. Urgent. His fingers trembled against her skin like he was holding something that might shatter. Kafir, he whispered in Pashto. Ghost. The word hung in the air between them like shrapnel suspended mid-flight. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Her face remained completely neutral as she finished adjusting the saline drip, her movements precise and deliberate, muscle memory taking over while her mind catalogued the implications. Former Taliban logistics officer, protected witness status, classified briefing materials she'd read before shift change. He'd been in Kandahar. He'd operated in the same sector where she'd extracted the CIA asset 18 months ago, the mission that had erased her name from every database, the operation that had turned Captain Brooke Sullivan into just a nurse named Brooke. The escort guard tensed. Brooke squeezed the patient's hand, not reassurance, information, and stepped away from the bed without looking back. Her heart rate remained steady. Her hands remained steady. That was the gift of combat trauma. Once you'd felt actual fear, the smaller varieties lost their teeth. A Marine colonel was waiting in the hallway. Not in uniform, but you could see it in the way he stood, the way his eyes tracked movement, the particular stillness that came from having trained your nervous system to operate under fire. His name tag read Vance. He'd arrived with the armed escort detail, had spent the last 6 hours in the observation room watching the patient sleep, and now he was looking at Brooke with the expression of someone who'd just received confirmation of a suspicion he'd been carrying for 18 months. "Captain Sullivan," he said quietly. "Not a question." Brooke's jaw tightened, a single involuntary movement. The trembling wasn't fear, it was restraint, but she kept walking toward the nurse station, her pace unhurried. The hospital corridor stretched out like a runway, fluorescent lights overhead casting everything in that particular institutional white that made time feel suspended. Colonel Vance followed. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Lower. Command voice. "Your sealed file just became relevant," he said. "That patient in 412 is Ahmed Farrokh. He was logistics coordinator for the Taliban cell operating in Sanjin Valley. He's testifying against 3 warlords in federal court. And he just identified you as the ghost who walked into a safe house in Kandahar city in March 2022 and walked out with a CIA asset that for Pakistani intelligence officers were hunting." He paused at the nurse station entrance, letting those words settle. "You want to tell me why a decorated combat veteran is working night shifts at St. Michael's Hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina?" The room had filled with staff, nurses, residents, a few attending physicians who'd heard the commotion and drifted over like flies to fluorescent light. They stood in that particular hospital configuration, close enough to eavesdrop, far enough to pretend they weren't. Brooke recognized most of them from grand rounds, from the conference where Pierce had paraded her failure in front of 12 assembled physicians who'd all turned away rather than defend her. She didn't answer Vance. Instead, she moved to the computer terminal and logged into the patient system, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the same precision she used during medical crises. Background check. Verification protocol. She knew how this worked. She'd lived the classified side of this machinery for 7 years before the disavowal, before Morrison had come to that Waffle House and told her she didn't exist anymore. That's when Dr. Pierce appeared. He materialized from the corridor like something summoned by the chaos, his face already cycling through expressions, confusion, then recognition, then something sharp and predatory that made the air pressure change. His voice, when it came, was shrill and accusatory, the same tone he'd used during grand rounds, but now it had an edge of desperation underneath. "This is impersonation," he said loudly. "Military fraud. Whatever credentials you're claiming, they're fake. This woman has been misrepresenting herself to this hospital for 18 months. I have documentation of her personnel file, her background check. There's no military service listed, no." Colonel Vance pulled a folder from his jacket. Standard manila, unremarkable, except for the red security stripe stamped across the cover. His hand was steady as he opened it and began reading aloud. "Navy Cross for Valor under fire," he said. His voice carried across the entire floor. A few more staff members appeared, drawn by the certainty in his tone. "During Operation Enduring Freedom, Afghanistan, March 2022. Extracted a high-value intelligence asset while under sustained fire from hostile forces. Engaged multiple Taliban fighters in direct combat while maintaining protection of the asset. Actions prevented a critical intelligence breach and saved the lives of 12 embedded operators." Pierce's mouth opened. No sound came out. Vance turned the page. Bronze Star with V device. 2 separate combat engagements, Helm and Province, 2022. Multiple casualties under her direct medical care, field trauma protocol, sustained operations beyond normal combat duration. Another page turn. His voice didn't waver. First Purple Heart, fragmentation wounds, IED detonation, Jolon District. Second Purple Heart, gunshot wound to left shoulder, indirect fire engagement, Sanjin Valley. Third Purple Heart, blast trauma and concussion, vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, FOB Shank Sector. The hospital had gone so quiet you could hear the ventilation system hum beneath the fluorescent lights. Brooke stood perfectly still, watching Pierce's face cycle through denial and something that looked almost like fear. This was what happened when the truth collided with institutional power that wasn't actually power at all, just position. Pierce's voice rose again, shriller now, his composure fracturing like old paint. "This is irrelevant," he said. "What matters is hospital policy, credentialing, the regulatory framework that governs. What you're hearing is the audio recording of your conversation with Pharmaceutical Representative Mark Davidson last month," a new voice said. The Pentagon liaison appeared in the hallway, a woman in a dark suit, carrying a device that looked like a standard tablet but carried the weight of federal authority. She pressed play without waiting for permission, and Pierce's own voice filled the corridor, discussing inflated billing codes, discussing phantom procedures, discussing kickback arrangements with the precision of someone who'd done this dozens of times and never expected to be recorded. "So we bill a full spinal fusion even if it's just a laminectomy. They never cross-reference the operative notes with the billing department." The voice cut off. The liaison looked at Pierce with the particular contempt reserved for people who'd exploited the system he'd sworn to serve. "That conversation was monitored under federal investigation warrants," she said quietly. "Dr. Davidson turned state's evidence 2 weeks ago. The FBI has 247 billing records showing procedures you charged that were never performed. Medicaid fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy. Your medical privileges are under emergency suspension effective immediately." Security had appeared, though Brooke hadn't seen them approach. They moved with the same practiced efficiency she'd trained with at JSOC facilities, no drama, no aggression, just the clear understanding that they would be leaving with Pierce regardless of his cooperation. He stood frozen for a moment, his cardboard box of personal items already waiting by the elevator as if it had been prepared days in advance. That's when the helicopter appeared outside the window. Not a routine medical transport. A Black Hawk with military paint scheme, the kind of aircraft that didn't land at civilian hospitals unless the stakes had shifted into federal jurisdiction. General Richardson emerged from the stairwell, 2-star insignia gleaming, escorted by 3 officers in Navy dress uniforms. He looked at Brooke with the particular respect reserved for people who'd earned their scars in the dark. "Captain Sullivan," he said, and the entire floor heard the rank recognition, heard the confirmation that she wasn't a nurse named Brooke, she was Captain Brooke Sullivan, and her service record had just been validated by someone with the authority to speak for the entire defense apparatus. "On behalf of Naval Special Operations Command, we are formally restoring your service designation and recommending you for appointment as Director of Emergency Medicine here at St. Michael's. Your termination is null and void. Your civilian identity protection remains in effect for operational security purposes, but your classified record is now unsealed." Pierce was being escorted out by security now, his face blank with shock. He passed Brooke without looking at her. 1 cardboard box. 1 life, disassembled into something that could fit in the elevator. What happened in the next 72 hours happened at the speed of institutional crisis management. The hospital video, the hallway confrontation, the general salute, the billing fraud recording playing for 36 witnesses, went viral across medical Twitter, military forums, 3 major news networks. St. Michael's board convened an emergency session. The administrator, a cautious man named Kent, reviewed the evidence, 6 weeks of FBI financial investigation, pharmaceutical rep testimony, 247 procedures charged but never performed, kickbacks totaling $1.2 million across 34 months. But the real damage came from Dr. Gerald Caldwell. Caldwell was Pierce's medical school mentor, chief of surgery at Johns Hopkins, author of 3 textbooks, the man who'd written Pierce's residency recommendation 20 years ago and watched his career climb into prominence. He saw the viral video by noon. By 14:45 that same day, his public statement was released. "I am horrified by Dr. Pierce's actions, both ethical and personal. His cruelty to a decorated veteran and his financial crimes represent everything wrong with modern medicine. I was wrong about his character. I withdraw any professional association or support." The statement trended nationally within minutes. By 1600, the North Carolina Medical Board initiated emergency license suspension proceedings. St. Michael's terminated Pierce's privileges at 1700, security escorting him from the building with the same theatrical public walk he'd forced on Brooke. He carried one cardboard box. Former colleagues turned away as he passed. By Friday, 3 law firms declined his case. Criminal charges for insurance fraud and Medicaid theft filed Monday. His wife filed for divorce Wednesday. His legal fees consumed his savings. His house went into foreclosure. The only employment offer he received was teaching CPR certification at Raleigh Community College for $14.50 per hour, where he warned students that one mistake could destroy everything, his voice bitter and performative, his hands trembling as he demonstrated compression ratios to people who had no idea who he was. 6 months later, Brooke stood in her new office at St. Michael's Hospital, Director of Emergency Medicine now, the title engraved on oak and mounted beside the door. She wore navy dress whites for the appointment ceremony, the uniform she'd locked away for 18 months now bearing the ribbons that marked her service in places whose names remained classified. General Richardson pinned the certificate while Captain Hayes, recovered and returned to active duty, presented her with a faded unit patch from the 5th Fleet, the same patch she'd worn during the safe house extraction in Kandahar. It was framed now, mounted on her office wall above her desk, fabric-worn and sun-bleached but unmistakable. 12 doctors reviewed your case and said wait, Hayes said quietly during the ceremony. 12 experienced physicians, following protocol, making reasonable decisions. You ignored every single one of them. Brooke's response was quiet, her voice carrying the particular authority that came from having survived things that would have broken most people. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. Hayes saluted. She returned it. He left, and Brooke sat at her desk, opening the first case file of her directorship, her hand steady, her face neutral, already working. The hospital corridor stretched out beyond her window, full of staff who'd once turned away during grand rounds, full of patients who'd never know her name or what she'd sacrificed to be there. That was enough. It had always been enough. Subscribe to see more stories like this one, because the quietest people in the room are often the ones holding everything together. Like this video if Brooke's composure throughout her vindication inspired you. Comment below, what would you have done if 12 people told you to wait?